We will come to order. A quorum being present. Before we turn to our markup, there's a matter of committee business to address. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Rooney, has left the committee, leaving open seats on the subcommittee on Health, Employment, Labor, and Pensions, and the subcommittee on Workforce Protections. And Mr. Keller of Pennsylvania has joined the committee. I'd like to welcome, is he here? Mr. Was here. I'd like to welcome Mr. Keller to the committee and ask unanimous consent that he be appointed to fill the vacancies on the Subcommittee on Health, Employment, Labor, and Pensions and the Subcommittee on Workforce Protections left by Mr. Rooney. If there are no objections, so ordered. We'll now turn to, and I'd like to welcome him to the committee. We now turn to our markup. The committee meets today pursuant to notice to consider H.R. 4334, the Dignity and Aging Act of 2019, and H.R. 4301, the School Shooting Safety and Preparedness Act. Chair announces that any request for recorded votes will be rolled pursuant to Clause 2, Rule 11 of the Rules of the House of Representatives and Committee Rule 13B. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 1, the chair may recess the committee at any point. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Today, the committee is considering two pieces of legislation, H.R. 4334, the Dignity and Aging Act, and H.R. 4301, the School Shooting Safety and Preparedness Act. The first bill before us today, the Dignity and Aging Act, is a bipartisan proposal to reauthorize the Older Americans Act, or OAA, which expires at the end of the month. OAA was first passed in 1965 alongside of Medicare, Medicaid, and landmark civil rights laws as part of the Johnson's Great Society initiative. Today, OAA supports an array of popular community-based programs to help 11 million aging Americans retain independence and avoid costly institutional care. This includes 3 million older Americans who regularly look to OAA services for basic needs, such as Meals on Wheels and transportation services. But as the population of Americans aged 60 and over has grown, funding for OAA has not kept pace. In 2010, the OAA funding was $42.95 per senior in today's dollars. Today, it is just $27.25 per senior. As a result of eroded funding, OAA services do not reach 83% of low-income older Americans who experience food insecurity, according to a 2015 GAO report. Congress must recommit to providing critical services and care to aging Americans, and to that end, this reauthorization of the Dignity and Aging Act does the following. It authorizes robust funding increases for OAA programs, which will help expand access to food assistance, transportation, and other basic services that a growing population of seniors need to live independently and with dignity. All OAA programs will receive an immediate 7% increase in fiscal year 2020 and 6% increase each of the following 4 years. This will boost funding for OAA's the Act's historical high watermark. This bipartisan proposal also recognizes the vital role that family caregivers in supporting aging Americans. It extends the authorization of the Raise Family Caregivers Act, which requires the development of a national strategy to recognize and support family caregivers and improves the process for determining what types of support caregivers need. The bill also includes a new vital focus on the direct care workforce to ensure that workforce needs of the growing population can be met. Finally, the Dignity and Aging Act puts a stronger focus on combating social isolation, which greatly increases, that kind of isolation greatly increases the risk of stroke, heart disease, dementia, and premature death. The bill empowers local organizations to test solutions for social isolation and adds screening into health and supportive services that seniors receive. By passing this reauthorization, we can help millions of Americans across the country age with dignity, and I encourage all committee members to support it. I want to recognize and thank Mrs. Bonamici, Ms. Stefanik, Ms. Lee, and Mr. Carmer, Ms. Wild, and Mr. Johnson for their work and leadership in this vital bipartisan legislation. Second bill before us, the School Shooting Safety and Preparedness Act, will help us better understand how to prevent tragic school shootings. As this committee discussed during last week's hearing on trauma-informed school practices, children in the United States face the devastating trauma of gun violence more frequently than anywhere else in the world. Yet we have consistently failed to pass legislation to protect students, educators, and school staff. The committee has a responsibility to advance evidence-based legislation that ensures the safety of our schools. Today, committee members will have the opportunity to go beyond thoughts and prayers and take a concrete step towards policies to prevent gun violence. The School Shooting Safety and Preparedness Act specifically establishes a standard definition of school shooting, which currently does not exist in federal law. By doing so, both policymakers and the public will be able to objectively assess school gun violence incidents and the policy solutions we implement to stop them. The bill also directs the Department of Education to use this definition to report annually on school safety indicators for school shootings. These indicators capture critical statistics and information on not only school mass shootings, but the chronic gun violence that threatens students each day. This legislation alone will not eliminate school gun violence. It will help us better understand how and why school shootings occur and what can be done to stop them. This is a small but important step towards ensuring that classrooms are safe places where parents can have peace of mind and students are free to learn. I urge all committee members to support both of these bills under consideration today, and I now yield to the ranking member, Dr. Fox, for the purpose of making an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, we will mark up two bills. One is the product of diligent, bipartisan hard work and shows the good that can come from working together. The other, unfortunately, turns a serious issue into a political stunt instead of offering serious policy. Each of these bills focus on our nation's most vulnerable and valuable citizens, older Americans and school children. While the victory of successfully working to reauthorize the Older Americans Act is great, the failure to pass meaningful policy to help keep our kids safe at school is particularly disappointing. For over 50 years, the Older Americans Act, OAA, has helped provide social and nutrition services to older Americans. With more than 41 million Americans aged 65 and older, the programs and services offered by OAA are helping them maintain independence. The reach of this law is substantial and covers many aspects of elder care. In addition to well-known programs like Meals on Wheels, OAA supports services that include nutrition programs providing meals at senior centers, schools, and churches, care to prevent the abuse, neglect, and exploitation of seniors, family caregiver support systems, and community service employment opportunities for older Americans. The data shows overwhelmingly that these programs help older Americans live higher quality lives. This OAA reauthorization reflects our commitments to our nation's seniors and builds upon the law's flexible policies, allowing older Americans to age with health, dignity, and independence in the communities of their choosing. While I'm encouraged by the teamwork and bipartisanship that went into the OAA reauthorization, I wish we could have applied the same collaboration and serious conversations to H.R. 4301. Everyone in this room cares deeply about the safety and success of our nation's students, and we can all agree that school violence is a serious topic that deserves a serious conversation. Unfortunately, this bill falls far short. While school shootings are real threats our schools and children face, sadly, they are not the only threats they experience. The hearing held on September 11, 2019, which examined trauma-informed practices in education, made this very point. Students can experience trauma in a variety of frightening ways. The hearing did not discuss nor decide that complex, subjective, gun data collection is the solution to childhood trauma. While the Democrats may consider this recent hearing a legislative hearing for the bill we are now considering, none of the witness testimony mentioned the need for detailed firearm data. What was mentioned? When students experience trauma, it can lead to adverse behaviors, so teachers and school officials need to take proactive steps to connect with their students. H.R. 4301 seems to be an attempt to score political points instead of offering real solutions. The bill does not provide educators and school staff with the tools to help traumatized students. The data, which Democrats believe to be crucial, is largely already being collected by the relevant agencies. In fact, the overwhelming amount of reporting and collecting requirements included in the Democrats' bill would be difficult for the Department of Education to collect and will likely end up burdening schools. This bill and the unnecessary reporting requirements included in it are not about school safety, but instead about gun politics. That's why committee Republicans will offer a substitute amendment. I believe we can do more to ensure our nation's children are safe if we leave politically charged talking points at the door and put our heads together to pass meaningful reform. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The committee will now proceed with the consideration of the bill H.R. 4334 for amendment. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 4334 to amend the Older Americans Act of 1965 to authorize appropriations for fiscal years 2020 through 2024 and for other purposes.
Without objection, first reading of the bill is dispensed with. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point, and any amendment offered shall be considered as read. The clerk will now recognize the gentlelady from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici, for the purpose of an amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4334 offered by Ms. Bonamici of Oregon.
Without objection, the amendment shall be considered original text and open for amendment at any point. Amendment in nature of a substitute has already been distributed and is in each of your folders. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Oregon for 5 minutes to explain the amendment in nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of my colleagues and all of the staff on both sides of the aisle, especially Jack Arriaga from my office, for their hard work and support to get us to this markup of the Dignity in Aging Act. I'm proud to introduce this critical bipartisan reauthorization on behalf of the nearly 11 million seniors who are served by the important programs included in this bill. I'm offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute that contains several bipartisan improvements to the Dignity in Aging Act, including a new National Technical Assistance Center dedicated to expanding the Aging Network's capacity to deliver person-centered, trauma-informed services that meet the needs of aging trauma survivors, including veterans and Holocaust survivors. It also clarifies that religious, cultural, or ethnic requirements fall within the cultural considerations and preferences that we encourage senior meal programs to accommodate. Finally, the ANS includes support for older people with disabilities within evidence-based programs for home assessments, modifications, and fall prevention. As we mark up this bill today, I'm thinking of my mother, a 91-year-old two-time cancer survivor who also has Alzheimer's, and the importance of and challenges with meeting her specific and changing needs as she ages. Far too many older Americans don't have the same level of support and access to services that my mom has. There is a vast unmet need in our communities, in Oregon and across the United States. This leaves seniors without the care they need and deserve, care that allows them to age with dignity. I'm sure every person in this room has a friend or family member who can benefit from the life-saving programs bolstered by this legislation. I urge all of us to keep them in mind as we work through this markup. We have a moral obligation to take care of those who cared for us, and this is an opportunity to help fulfill that commitment. Crafting the Dignity in Aging Act required careful negotiations and tough decisions. It's always difficult to leave priorities and some desired outcomes on the table, but I want to thank Chairman Scott, Ranking Member Fox, and Ranking Member Comer, as well as all of the staff again, for working in good faith over many months to find a strong bipartisan compromise that we can all be proud of. This bill contains many provisions that will greatly strengthen the programs and services in the Older Americans Act. I am confident that we can move this legislation through both chambers and have it signed into law, giving more seniors the care and services they need. The Dignity in Aging Act will significantly increase funding for popular programs that many Americans rely on, such as Meals on Wheels. It extends the Raise Family Caregivers Act, which helps develop a national strategy to recognize and support family caregivers. This legislation increases the focus on the negative health outcomes associated with social isolation. It strengthens services available to Native Americans, and it promotes the ability of older individuals to age in the homes and communities they love. The list goes on. We worked closely with many national advocacy groups and stakeholder organizations to make sure our constituents who rely on these services will be well served under this reauthorization. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record letters of support and endorsement from the following: Meals on Wheels, the Leadership Council of Aging Organizations, the National Association of Area Agencies on Aging, the National Association of Nutrition and Aging Services Programs, the National Council on Aging, AARP, Grantmakers in the Arts, the Jewish Federations of North America, Gerontological Society of America, the Women's Institute for a Secure Retirement, the Alzheimer's Impact Movement. And I think there may be more letters coming. Lastly, we should remember—
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Even when this bill becomes law, our work will not be done. There is much more that we can and must do to fully meet the needs of all seniors and support often marginalized populations, such as LGBT seniors, who are more likely to face barriers to service, less likely to have supportive families, and are truly of the greatest need. We made some meaningful progress on this issue by lifting up the great work being done by SAGE, the National Resource Center on LGBT Aging, but we did not get as far this time as we would have liked, or that we know is necessary. This legislation is a strong starting point, and I look forward to working together to continue to build on the successes achieved in this bill until no one remains underserved and no senior is invisible. I urge all of my colleagues to support both this ANS and the underlying bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Are there any members who wish to be recognized for the discussion of the amendment nature of substitute? Gentlelady from New York.
Thank you, Chairman Scott, and I thank my colleague and friend, Ms. Bonamici from Oregon, for her hard work on this important bipartisan legislation. Innovations in science and technology are allowing Americans to live longer. In fact, the average life expectancy in America today is higher than in any other period in history, and our nation's senior population is expected to double by 2060. I proudly represent a district that has one of the largest constituencies of older Americans, so I am pleased to be co-leading this bipartisan legislation before us, which reauthorizes the Older Americans Act. Since 1965, this statute has provided a wide range of social and nutrition services for Americans aged 60 or older. These services help older Americans lead healthy and independent lives by offering meals, job training, health promotion, caregiver support, transportation, and more. Included in this legislation is language from my bipartisan bill with Congressman Levin encouraging the use of caregiver assessments to identify the needs of family caregivers. This individualized approach to care will ensure that both caregivers and those who require assistance are provided tailored support to achieve the best possible health outcomes. Additionally, it includes long overdue updates from the Younger Onset Alzheimer's Act I co-led with Congresswoman Rice. Those under 60 with this heartbreaking disease face unique hardships for both them and their families. This legislation ensures individuals of any age living with Alzheimer's receive full access to the services and support provided by the Older Americans Act. There is another group of older Americans in this country that we must not forget, the nearly 80,000 Holocaust survivors who live among us. As victims of truly the very worst of humanity, Holocaust survivors deserve devoted care and support to address the unimaginable, horrific trauma they experienced. Sadly, 1/3 of our country's Holocaust survivors live in poverty. This amendment, in the nature of a substitute, works to address the needs of aging Holocaust survivors. Specifically, the amendment codifies an existing National Technical Assistance Center devoted to expanding the capacity of the Aging Network to meet the needs of aging Holocaust survivors, veterans, and survivors of historical trauma. These men and women have survived unconscionable suffering, yet many continue to live with physical and emotional scars from the horror they faced. This amendment acknowledges their resilience and seeks to offer opportunities that allow them to live healthy, dignified, and independent lives through their elder years. Additionally, the amendment recognizes that OAA nutrition programs should meet the religious, cultural, or ethnic dietary requirements of all older Americans. Alongside the many changes we make to strengthen and improve the underlying bill, I am deeply encouraged that this committee will come together to recognize the unique risk institutionalization presents to Holocaust survivors. Including our bipartisan provision is essential to upholding the very spirit of this law. I urge my colleagues to vote yes to this amendment. In doing so, we reaffirm our commitment to our nation's older generation. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. The others want to be recognized. Gentlelady from Pennsylvania. Recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word. Back in 1965, when President Lyndon Johnson signed the Older Americans Act, Congress expressed a universal truth that has guided American policy for generations, that our federal, state, and local governments have a joint and several duty to assist our older populations and secure for them a life of dignity, good health, and honor. The OAA's objectives were to secure adequate income in retirement, the best possible physical and mental health services without regard to economic status, suitable housing and transportation, restorative services, and employment opportunities free of discrimination. In the words of President Johnson, the Older Americans Act clearly affirms our nation's sense of responsibility toward the well-being of our older citizens. But even more, the results of this act will help us to expand our opportunities for enriching the lives of all of our citizens in this country now and in the years to come. After years of contributing to our national, state, and local economies, the defense of our country, and arts and culture that our communities hold dear, it seemed like such a logical notion for Congress to repay the debt we owed to our older citizens. And the logic of that notion was borne out in a vote that saw 393 members of the House vote in favor and just one in opposition. In the Senate, it passed unanimously. Today, we are faced with a baby boomer generation in or approaching retirement, and with it, new challenges. Many of the programs funded through the OAA remain immensely popular, but funding has not kept pace. In 2010, OAA funding was approximately $42.95 per senior in today's dollars. Today, it is just $27.25 per senior. Every time funding fails to meet demand, the foundation of our great society is chipped away. Every time funding fails to meet demand, we run the risk of malnutrition, unsafe living conditions, and social isolation for our older Americans. Fortunately, there is a solution, and I applaud the Education and Labor Committee for acting with the urgency that this issue deserves. I am proud to be an original co-sponsor of the Dignity in Aging Act of 2019, a bipartisan reauthorization of the Older Americans Act, which gives all OAA programs an immediate 7% increase in fiscal year 2020 and a 6% increase every year thereafter. I am proud of the new provisions that will guide OAA's nutrition programs, programs that are both vital and popular among recipients. This bill includes language that will benefit our seniors by ensuring access to nutritional services that are culturally sensitive and reflect the diverse needs of our communities. This bill also creates an initiative to coordinate federal resources to promote safe, independent living, which includes necessary resources for fall prevention, as well as home assessment and modification. And I am particularly proud that this bill updates the OAA and puts a greater focus on countering social isolation, empowering local organizations to develop solutions, and incorporating social isolation screening into mental health and supportive services that seniors receive. Because our seniors must know that they are not alone. I am with them. This committee is with them. We as a nation are with them. I urge my colleagues to pass this bill out of committee, and I urge leadership to take this up on the House floor as soon as possible. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Are there others who wish to be recognized? Gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman.
I'm a big fan of Meals on Wheels, and I'm going to vote for this today. But I feel I have to point out to people in this room, almost anything, maybe I'll put it categorical, anything in this bill can probably be done better on a state or local level. I mean, this is the type of bill that's going to generate blizzards of paperwork for other people to fill out in order to make sure we're meeting federal standards and whatnot. And it just bothers me, the enthusiasm for feeling that all this is a federal problem when, you know, so clearly it would probably be done better and with less paperwork on a state or local level.
Thank you. Others wish to be recognized? Gentlelady from Connecticut, Ms. Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I thank the chair and my colleagues for their bipartisan work on this critical legislation that recognizes that older Americans, their caregivers, and their communities need robust support to help them combat everyday challenges and maintain their dignity in aging. My state, Connecticut, is the 7th oldest state, so I am particularly pleased to see that this bill eliminates the funding cap that limits the support older relative caregivers can receive under the National Family Caregiver Support Program, something that would have helped my grandmother as she shouldered the responsibility of raising my brother and I. There are so many aging Americans who are in the same predicament of now raising their grandchildren. This bill is deeply personal for me and for so many Americans who are trying to care for a parent, grandparent, or aging relative that is the nucleus of their family. The Dignity in Aging Act will continue the legacy of the Older Americans Act and help to achieve the promise of President Johnson's Great Society by making sure no American has to struggle under the weight of poverty, food insecurity, or financial insecurity just because they are aging. Older Americans in my district and in every community are waiting for us to take action. I urge my colleagues to support the passage of this bill in committee and then on the floor of the House, and I look forward to it being signed into law. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. Others wish to be recognized? Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me say how proud I am to be on this committee as we reauthorize the Older Americans Act. OAA programs like Meals on Wheels give older Americans the support they need to age independently and with dignity. Last month, I rode along with 2 volunteers who delivered meals through Macomb County's Meals on Wheels program, Larry and Mary Ellen Barnes. They've done the same route twice a month for 8 years. It was awesome to be a part of that work, which is so important to the health of our neighbors in Michigan's 9th District. And I'm thrilled to follow up that work today when we vote to extend this program nationally. I'm also excited that this bill includes Congresswoman Stefanik's and my Supporting Family Caregivers Act. This will help us determine what kinds of targeted support caregivers need as they provide in-home care to loved ones. So many of us will at some point either care for a family member or be cared for by a family member ourselves. We all have a stake in making sure caregivers get the personalized assistance they need to continue to care for their loved ones, and therefore ensure the best possible outcome for those for whom they care. I want to thank Congresswoman Stefanik for partnering with me on this bill, and thank you, and also thank Congresswoman Bonamici, you, Chairman Scott, and Ranking Member Fox for incorporating our bill in this reauthorization. I urge my colleagues to vote for this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Do others wish to be recognized? Gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized.
First of all, I'd like to start off by thanking my colleagues, Chairwoman Bonamici, Congresswoman Stefanik, and all of the staff for crafting this important piece of legislation. This bill is incredibly important to my district. I think it's personal to anyone who has had the experience of caring for a parent or a loved one. And it also funds dozens of critical programs that Southern Nevada seniors rely on every day. From Meals on Wheels to family caregiver to support to legal services and transportation, the Older Americans Act does not just save lives and improve Americans' quality of life, but it helps seniors avoid hospitalization or long-term financial and medical difficulties. I'm also strongly supportive of the direct care workforce provisions in this bill. There's a growing demand for direct care, but not enough workers to meet this demand. In fact, the Census Bureau has projected that the number of people aged 65 and older will more than double between 2015 and 2016, from 47.8 million to 98 million people. Additionally, by 2024 alone, an additional 5.2 million direct care workers will be needed. As we in this committee, as well as across this Congress, consider the future of work, we must recognize this important sector that will rely on humans to deliver service. This bill will provide funding for at least 15 entities to invest in the recruitment and training of our direct care workforce pipeline. And as we think of the care of older Americans, many of whom are nearest and dearest to us, we need to work collectively to ensure that individuals can live with dignity and the sufficient resources that they need. And this includes being able to age in place. I'm proud to be an original co-sponsor of this bill. I appreciate having the opportunity to vote, and I think it's a practical, bipartisan piece of legislation, and I urge all of my colleagues to support it. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there other members who wish to be recognized? If not, Gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized.
For the last 5 decades, the Older Americans Act has funded critical programs that help seniors age with dignity and security. Because of this landmark legislation, every day, millions of Americans over the age of 60 benefit from home-delivered meals, transportation to a local senior citizen or grocery store, preventive health services, job training, and safeguards against elder abuse. Unfortunately, the resources that make these supports available are dangerously strained. OAA funding has failed to keep pace with the growth of our senior population, which increased by 35% between 2007 and 2017 alone. As a result, 83% of low-income seniors in need of nutritional support do not receive meal services through AAA. Too many seniors must make difficult choices about how to stretch a limited budget to cover rent, groceries, and access to health care. For the most vulnerable, these decisions can have life-threatening implications. It is shameful that more than 4.5 million older Americans are living in poverty, many of whom previously worked full careers, raised families, and paid their dues to society. Even worse, Many seniors struggle with limited mobility and critical health needs and are subject to abuse, neglect, and exploitation. I'm proud to support the Dignity in Aging Act of 2019, which reauthorizes OAA with substantially increased funding to better reach this population. Everyone should be able to age gracefully without worrying about where their next meal is coming from or feeling isolated and abandoned. H.R. 4334 moves us closer to this goal by strengthening programs like Meals on Wheels, increasing support for caregivers, empowering support organizations to screen for social isolation, and charging states and local agencies with improving their outreach efforts. We've all had someone in our lives who we've cared for as they age, a friend, a parent, or a grandparent. By passing H.R. 4334, we can make a strong statement about the quality of care that they deserve and the importance of treating all senior citizens with dignity and with respect. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. The others who wish to be recognized, gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Adams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. Mr. Chairman, I speak in support of H.R. 4334, the Dignity in Aging Act. Since 2001, funding for the Older Americans Act, OAA, has increased about 1.1% on average. At the same time, over 10,000 people a day turn 65 years of age. In order to keep up with our aging baby boom population, it's clear that we need to provide steady, consistent increases to OAA funding. Well, I'm happy to support this effort that does just that, and does it in a bipartisan manner. The Dignity in Aging Act will provide support to those who care for our elderly, provide economic opportunity to aging populations, and most importantly, provide a solid 7% increase in funding in fiscal year 2020 and 6% increases in every fiscal year thereafter. This will bolster important programs such as Meals on Wheels and legal services, and it will give our seniors the independence that they so desperately need and value. I want to thank Representative Bonamici for her leadership on this initiative, and I would certainly encourage all of my colleagues to support this bill. I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. The others wish to be recognized? If not, does any member wish to offer an amendment? The gentlelady from Oregon has an amendment to the
Thank you, Mr.
amendment
Chairman.
next to the substitute.
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Ms. Bonamici of Oregon to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4334.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment reflects a bipartisan agreement to incorporate priorities of several members that I'm glad we could accommodate these issues that were not quite fully addressed in the underlying bill, and it shows just how collaborative this process was. This amendment makes some technical changes and requires assurances from the area agencies on aging that they will conduct outreach to older individuals at risk for institutional placement, specifically including survivors of the Holocaust. The amendment also codifies the existing National Resource Center for Women in Retirement, and it also includes a definition of person-centered trauma-informed services, which is important because it often includes veterans who, after serving our country, may return home scarred by war in ways that we can't see. And again, as mentioned before, as the remaining survivors of the Holocaust and others with trauma age, we must make sure they are fully supported and that their unique needs are met and their stories are heard and remembered. So again, this shows how collaborative the process was, proves what we can accomplish when we work together, and I encourage all my colleagues to support this amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Does someone wish to speak on the
Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank all of my colleagues again for working together on this bill to reauthorize the Older Americans Act in a bipartisan manner. This is an example of what Congress is able to accomplish when we put our heads together in search of productive solutions. For example, this amendment includes some important language designed to ensure that area agencies on aging are doing specific outreach to Holocaust survivors to ensure they're able to age with dignity in their homes or locations where they are most vulnerable, again, as my colleague from Oregon has mentioned. This amendment also provides some additional information and accountability around individuals being served by the National Resource Centers. This amendment also includes language codifying the National Resource Center on Women in Retirement Planning. This is one provision where Congress has inserted itself into a situation where the private sector would be more effective and would not add to the already tremendous strain on taxpayer dollars. Given the already limited resources under this act, it should not be the role of the federal government to run a center whose activities would likely be performed by private entities. That being said, in order to respect the bipartisan nature of this markup, I'll let this provision go and support the other good provisions in this amendment. I yield back.
Thank you. Are there other comments on the amendment? If not, all in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. Ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Are there other amendments? Gentleman from Kentucky.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Guthrie and Mr. Trone to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4334.
Gentlemen, will suspend. Do we have the amendments? Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I really appreciate it, and I'm proud to offer this amendment with my friend from Maryland, Mr. Trone. Chronic pain is one of the most common, costly, and debilitating conditions for older adults that significantly alter many seniors' abilities. Not only are older individuals more likely to suffer from chronic pain, but chronic pain can be very difficult to manage for seniors due to higher usage of prescription medicines, which can lead to misuse and abuse. The devastating effects of the opioid epidemic have put a spotlight on the need for additional supports for seniors suffering from chronic pain. So what this amendment does, it adds chronic pain management programs to the list of evidence-based health promotion programs included in the definition of disease prevention and health promotion services for the Administration on Aging. Adopting this amendment will provide seniors with resources to effectively manage chronic pain, mitigate the risk of opioid abuse by improving pain management best practices, and allowing seniors to live healthy and independent lives. I want to thank Congressman Trone for working with me on this issue. I urge the support of this amendment, and I will yield back my time.
Does wish to speak to the amendment? If, young lady from Oregon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Young lady is recognized.
I just want to thank my colleagues, Representative Guthrie and Representative Trone, for this good bipartisan amendment. As we have seen the opioid crisis devastate families in Oregon and across the nation, this is an important amendment. We need to do a better job of treating chronic pain without exposing people to the risks of addiction, and adding chronic pain management to disease prevention will encourage providers and patients to seek out effective non-opioid treatments. So this is a good improvement to the underlying bill, and I encourage my colleagues to support it, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Does others wish to speak to the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. Ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Are there other amendments? Gentleman from
South Dakota, sir. Over here.
South Dakota.
All right, sounds very good.
recognized for an
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Johnson and Ms. Shalala to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4334.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you for recognizing me, Mr. Chair. I am honored to offer this amendment with my colleague from Florida, Congresswoman Shalala. And I'm also proud to be an original co-sponsor of the underlying bill, the Dignity in Aging Act. because it provides much-needed support for these important state and local programs that provide these great supports for older Americans. And over time, those supports, those programs can improve the quality of life and they can drive down costs, and both of those things are important. Now, I think most of us probably realize that seniors are more at risk when disaster strikes, when we have natural disasters and emergencies. And I thought it was interesting, according to the National Institute of Health, 2/3 of Americans over 50 years old say that they've never researched or analyzed or read any information about emergency preparedness. And 15% of those older Americans are on electrically powered medical devices that are at risk when the electricity goes out. And I think we're called as a committee, as a body, to do what we can to make sure that seniors are ready when catastrophic events happen. And so the amendment that Congresswoman Shalala and I have put forward simply clarifies that the Assistant Secretary for Aging and the Administration for Community Living at HHS should share technical assistance. They should share best practices with state and local agencies on the preparation of emergency response plans and on making sure that they're ready to provide supports to older Americans in the event of a disaster. I think this amendment makes for an important clarification. It's going to ensure that seniors and all of the organizations involved with these programs that are on the ground, that are on the front lines, are prepared when this bad news strikes. And so, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the Congresswoman from Florida working with me on this issue. I urge support of the amendment, and of course, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Other comments? Gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Shalala.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to join my colleague from South Dakota in co-sponsoring this amendment. Mr. Chairman, I am an older American. When I was Mr. Johnson's age, I actually created the position of the Assistant Secretary for Aging. Seniors are a particularly vulnerable population when it comes to disasters, and that's why we're offering this amendment. They're often isolated, sometimes unable to drive, often with limited access to funds, and sometimes dependent on caregivers. This combination can be deadly in a disaster situation. In Florida, we know this too well. 2 years ago this week, in the aftermath of Hurricane Irma, 12 people died of heat exposure in a nursing home that had lost power and its access to air conditioning. Recently, during Hurricane Dorian, the Florida coast and my district, my field office, fielded an urgent call from a homebound senior who had no money, no transportation, and no ability to protect herself from an impending hurricane. Fortunately, my district was not hit by Hurricane Dorian. A recent GAO report enumerated the challenges older individuals or those with disabilities have in accessing assistance before and during and after a disaster. This can range from difficulties evacuating to a safe shelter to accessing medicine and obtaining recovery assistance after the disaster. After that report, I joined my colleagues, Representative Langevin and Chris Smith, and Senators Casey and Collins, to introduce the Real Emergency Access for Aging and Disability Inclusion for Disasters Act, which would help with the development of emergency and disaster preparation plans to address the unique needs of older Americans and people with disabilities. I also introduced with Senators Casey and Representative Langevin and Gonzalez-Colin the Disaster Relief Medicaid Act, which would ensure that seniors and people with disabilities who are receiving Medicaid long-term services and supports are able to keep those services if they need to evacuate to another state. I appreciate the opportunity to introduce this amendment with my colleague, Representative Johnson, today to help ensure that when we are planning for disasters, the unique needs of some of our most vulnerable communities are accounted for. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Are there others who wish to speak on the amendment? Gentlelady from Oregon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Representatives Johnson and Shalala for offering this important amendment, because making communities more resilient now will save lives and help our communities recover faster after a disaster. Off the coast of the Pacific Northwest is the Cascadia subduction zone, and the question isn't if we will have an earthquake and tsunami, it is when we will have an earthquake and tsunami. And we have to think about the specific needs of older adults when developing emergency preparedness plans. This amendment will encourage proactive, long-term thinking about how to protect those who may not be able to protect themselves. It is a wonderful and important addition to the underlying bill, and I encourage all of my colleagues to support it, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The others wish to be heard on the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. Ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Are there other amendments?
Mr. Chairman,
Gentleman from California, Mr. Takano.
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Takano of California to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4334.
Gentleman is recognized on this amendment for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Scott and Subcommittee Chair Bonamici, for your commitment toward achieving equality for older Americans. The Older Americans Act is a critical piece of legislation that ensures we have the proper safeguards against abuse and neglect of aging Americans. I'm happy that this legislation was crafted in a bipartisan manner. And as a member of the LGBT Equality Caucus, I am pleased to work alongside our members of the caucus, including Chairman Scott and Chairwoman Bonamici, as we look to achieve equity for all. LGBT seniors are an extremely vulnerable population. They are twice as likely to age alone and be socially isolated, and they're more likely to have a disability and face higher levels of poverty. They grew up during a time when discrimination in housing and employment and limited access to health care was the norm. These seniors have often been rejected by their families and have lived with the ongoing threat of violence. So, I must express that I, along with other members of the caucus, are disappointed that at the end of the day, there wasn't more that could be done in this reauthorization of the Older Americans Act to address the inequities that these seniors face. It is a shame that in 2019, the mere mention of the letters LGBT would upset the ranking member and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. It's shameful. And I'm sure that everyone on this side agrees that in an era where the rights of LGBT people are increasingly a part of the mainstream discourse, we cannot be invisible. As a member of the LGBT Equality Caucus, I must reiterate that our members should be engaged early and seriously on issues before the committee that impact the LGBT community. Not only have our constituents elected us to do so, but we have a unique perspective to offer that as invaluable to these. We have something invaluable to offer to these discussions. Our community is counting on us to be their voice. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Are there others who wish to be heard on the amendment? Gentlelady from Oregon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
The lady is recognized.
I want to thank Representative Takano for offering this amendment. It is my understanding that the amendment will be withdrawn before a vote. I want to assure Mr. Takano and others here today that a top priority of mine in this process, going back to 2015 when I started working on the Older Americans Act, was to advance policies to protect marginalized groups, especially the LGBT community. Our LGBT seniors have been through a lifetime of discrimination. They face significantly increased risk of social isolation. They are twice as likely to live alone and half as likely to have close relatives to call for help, 4 times less likely to have children to help take care for them. And it is why I have introduced the Ruthie and Connie LGBT Elder Americans Act, a bill that specifically recognizes and serves this important population. I am pleased that the bill we are considering today does make meaningful steps to support LGBT seniors and other vulnerable groups. And I look forward to continuing to work with Mr. Takano and other members on this issue, including the Equality Caucus, and on finding other opportunities to make sure that we are serving every senior, including every LGBT individual. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The others wish to be heard on the amendment? Gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, at this time, I will withdraw my amendment.
Without objection, the amendment is withdrawn. Are there further amendments? Gentleman from New York, Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Morelli and Ms. Stefanik to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4334.
Gentleman's recognized on this amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Fox for your work on this meaningful bipartisan legislation to reauthorize the Older Americans Act. As our loved ones get older, we must ensure that they have the resources and support to age comfortably and safely. We know that seniors and individuals with disabilities overwhelmingly wish to stay in the comfort of their own homes as they age, but too often, houses lack accessibility features, making living independently difficult and oftentimes unsafe. Simple home modifications can help make this a reality, but for too many Americans, high costs and lack of accessibility keep those updates out of reach. I am proud that the bill we are marking up today includes language from my bipartisan bill, the Senior and Disabled Home Modification Assistance Initiative Act, to help make it easier to access key resources in federal home modification resource that would enable seniors and individuals with disabilities to age safely and live independently, keeping them out of institutions, saving literally hundreds of millions of dollars and enhancing the quality of their lives. Establishing these resources is half the battle. We must also ensure the information is accessible to those who need it. The amendment that my colleague, Representative Stefanik, and I are offering today aims to do just that, and I would just like to thank Representative Stefanik not only for her help on this amendment, but her leadership on the bill in chief. Our amendment directs the Assistant Secretary for Aging to include in the triannual report information about the availability, accessibility, and relevance of consumer-friendly resources for older individuals attempting to live independently and safely in the comfort of their own homes. And too often, meaningful resources created by this body and the federal government go unused simply because individuals don't know that they exist. So I want to make sure the critical home modification resources that currently exist are bolstered through this legislation and are bolstered by this through this legislation are easily accessible to the American people, and I'm proud that this amendment helps to do just that. Thank you again to my fellow colleague from New York for her support on the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member Fox, for your leadership on this important issue, and I encourage all my colleagues to join me in supporting this amendment as well as the full Dignity in Aging Act, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Other comments? Gentlelady from New York.
Thank you, Chairman Scott. I am very proud to co-sponsor this amendment with my colleague from New York, Representative Morelli. As he mentioned, the Older Americans Act provides essential resources and support services to seniors that allow them to live independently in their communities. Unfortunately, there are many seniors who are unaware of these resources and the benefits they provide. Increasing awareness of these programs could significantly improve the lives of older adults who are in need of these supportive services but do not take advantage of them. This amendment addresses this by requiring the Assistant Secretary to report to Congress on the availability of consumer-friendly resources for seniors and their caregivers. This report will help us identify areas of improvement and best practices to ensure that all seniors, particularly seniors from rural areas like my district, have the information and access to support services needed to live independently. Again, I appreciate my colleague, Representative Morelli from the great state of New York, working with me on this issue and reaching out. I urge support of this bipartisan amendment, and I yield back the balance.
Thank you. The other comments on the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment will say aye. All opposed, say no. Ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. The next amendment is the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Thompson and Mr. Castro to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4334.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Well, thank you, Chairman, for recognizing me. I'm proud to offer this amendment with my colleague, Representative Castro. The Older Americans Act is an important law that supports critical programs like Meals on Wheels, which are designed to help seniors maintain their dignity and independence as they age. It also helps older Americans who take on the vital role of caregiver when parents are unable to care for their children because of various struggles, but today that primary struggle is with opioids, with substance abuse. Sadly, this population has grown in recent years as the problem of substance abuse and opioids is swept across our country. Now, this amendment is fairly simple. It extends the authorization of the Supporting Grandparents Raising Grandchildren Act by 1 year, which allows the Advisory Council convened by the Act to develop meaningful recommendations and best practices for supporting the grandparents and older relatives who've stepped into the gap to support these children in need. There's no magic policy that will end the substance abuse and opioids epidemic, but we must ensure that we are utilizing every tool to help communities fight it, and we need to help our older adults who find themselves back in a primary caregiving role. I appreciate the Congress from Texas working with me on this issue, and I urge support of the amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Do others wish to comment? Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Chairman, and I'm proud to co-lead the amendment with my colleague, Mr. Thompson. The amendment would extend the authorization for the Supporting Grandparents Raising Grandchildren Act, and as the number of grandparents who are caring for children continues to rise, extending this bill will help support these families. Providing care to children can come with a cost, as grandparents are left with less time and ability to address their own health care concerns. The Supporting Grandparents Raising Grandchildren Act establishes an advisory council to support grandparents by providing resources to help them meet health, educational, and nutritional needs for both themselves and the children in their care. It's crucial for children that their senior caretakers are given the resources and best practices that they need. When a grandparent steps up to care for a grandchild, while it can be a rewarding experience, it can also occur during a difficult time, leaving the grandparent to cope with both their own and the child's grief. Without help, this can leave an entire family in a stressful, precarious, and unstable situation. However, there are tools and other resources that can help these families create stability in their lives. This amendment ensures that families and Congress continue to know about available resources and best practices. And I worked for years on this issue of grandparents raising their grandkids and other relatives raising the children of relatives for many years in San Antonio, and the number of people who are in that situation is continuing to grow. The number of grandparents who are stepping up essentially for the second time in their lives, becoming parents again. You think about as parents who have their kids in their home for at least the first 18 years, these are grandparents who are stepping up and for another 18 years or so having kids in their homes. And so it can be because the parents have lost their kids, have had their kids removed from their home by Child Protective Services, for example. Sometimes because the parents have passed away, sometimes because the parents have gone to jail or prison, and these folks are having to step up. So I hope that this Congress will continue to provide resources to grandparents and to other relatives who are stepping in and raising kids who are not their own. I want to say a quick thank you in San Antonio to my good friend Mary Moreno, who championed this issue for so long. We worked on the legislature together on it, and to Cynthia Chapa, who was my district director, who is now a district judge in San Antonio, who also helped me work on this issue in Texas and in San Antonio for quite a while. Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Are there other comments on the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment. All in favor will say aye. All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Ms. Wild to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4334.
Young lady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am proud to be an original co-sponsor of the Bipartisan Dignity and Aging Act, but there is one critical issue that we must not overlook. In 2017, there were more than 47,000 suicides in this country and more than 1.4 million suicide attempts. Across our country, suicide rates rose by 30% between 1999 and 2018. And individuals over the age of 55 have the most alarming rate of suicide, particularly among older white males, a demographic that has experienced a 40% increase over the past 20 years. I shared my own loss with all of you on the House floor a couple of months ago as part of my effort to bring about good from this devastating loss. I have called for the creation of a stigma-free environment to mental health care. The idea is simple. People should not feel shame seeking treatment for mental health disorders because that treatment should be treated the same as treatment for any other disease or condition. But in order for us to create that environment and save lives, we must first ensure that people have easy access to suicide prevention and mental health services and programs. That's exactly what my amendment does for our seniors. To be clear, the Dignity and Aging Act of 2019 should be applauded for its provisions aimed at countering social isolation among seniors. But this bill can be improved by simply adding, quote, screening for suicide risk, end quote, to the definition of disease prevention and health promotion services set forth in Section 102, paren 14 and paren. As the Aging Services Network of the OAA continues to move toward wider implementation of disease prevention and health promotion programs that have been demonstrated to improve the life of our seniors, we have a unique opportunity to make sure that a significant portion of our senior population does not slip through the cracks. I urge a yes vote on this amendment, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Any further comment on gentleman from Tennessee, Dr. Rowe?
Just briefly, Mr. Chairman, but I agree very much with my colleague. And when I graduated from medical school in 1970, we had 500,000 inpatient psychiatric beds in this country. The population's grown 30, 40% since that time. We have less than 50,000 beds. We have a mental health system in this country that's dysfunctional. It's not meeting the needs. So anything that we can do to help reduce the suicide rate, I wholeheartedly agree with. And I thank my colleague for placing this amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you. Are there other comments on the amendment? If not, all the question is on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. All opposed will say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. The gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for recognizing me. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Keller to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4334.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm proud to sponsor this amendment regarding traumatic brain injury. The Older Americans Act provides many necessary services for our country's seniors, and the underlying bill that we are considering today is a positive step toward ensuring the continued independence and health of this population. In recent years, there has been a growing body of evidence related to the problem of traumatic brain injuries, or TBI, in the senior population. In 2014, falls were the leading cause of traumatic brain injuries and accounted for almost half of all TBI-related emergency department visits. 4 in 5 TBI-related emergency department visits in older adults aged 65 years and older were caused by falls. The rates were even higher for individuals 75 years and older. This amendment adds fall-related TBI services to the definition of disease prevention and health promotion services, and adds related screening and public awareness building as an allowable use to existing grants. This important step in detecting these injuries early and ensuring that seniors receive the needed care as soon as possible. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you. The other comments on the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment will say aye. All opposed say no. Ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Harder.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Harder of California to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4334.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment. Gentleman's recognized.
In high school, my mom and I would drive around and deliver meals to seniors through Meals on Wheels. We'd go door to door in Modesto, California, making sure our neighbors had enough to eat. However, I quickly learned that we were bringing more than just food to those seniors. We were also bringing some of the only human contact a lot of these folks got on a daily basis. I saw the impact that had on the lives of dozens of seniors in my community. And this isn't just touchy-feely, this is hard scientific evidence from the National Institutes of Health that indicates that social isolation causes a litany of different health problems that can even lead to an early death for seniors. My amendment will help make us find better strategies to respond to social isolation and give older Americans a healthier path to aging. The advisory committee that the base bill creates will help combat this problem. But as written, it doesn't include the perspectives of family caregivers who have unique perspectives on the needs of their aging loved ones. My amendment will simply ensure that family caregivers have a seat at the table. It's expected that as the baby boomers age into retirement, caregivers will take an even larger role in the lives of their loved ones. Many of our families know this firsthand. We have to make sure that their voices are heard on the committee so that we can take their concerns into account as we draft new solutions to supporting our seniors. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. The other comments on the amendment? If not, question is on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment will say aye. All opposed will say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. The gentlelady from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Ms. Underwood and Mr. Rowe to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4334.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment.
Thank you. Reauthorization of the Older Americans Act has been a big local priority in my community in Northern Illinois. During the August work period, I held a roundtable with local stakeholders. Their priorities for reauthorization included increased funding, transportation, and support for seniors who age in place and their caregivers. That's why the bill that we're marking up today, among other improvements, increases overall and transportation program funding by 35%, improves access to that funding, increases availability and accessibility of meals for seniors, and strengthens support for family caregivers. I'm also pleased that this reauthorization has proceeded in a bipartisan manner, and I encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support my amendment as well. It's a bipartisan amendment introduced with Dr. Rowe from Tennessee. The amendment simply adds, quote, public health emergencies and emerging health threat response, end quote, to the definition of disease prevention and health promotion services. It would ensure that programs and settings that serve seniors are ready to respond to outbreaks or other public health emergencies. This is particularly timely in my district, where we're currently combating an outbreak of Legionnaire's disease that's affecting local seniors. Seniors can be especially vulnerable to infectious diseases and other outbreaks, so being prepared to respond to potential public health crises in a way that takes account of seniors' needs is essential. I urge support of this amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you. The other comments, gentleman from Tennessee, Dr. Rowe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm proud to join my colleague, Congresswoman Underwood, in offering this amendment to ensure state and area agencies on aging can use existing federal grant funds to address public health emergencies and emerging health threats as part of efforts to ensure proper disease prevention and health promotion services for our seniors. Most recently, our country has seen the rise of an opioid addiction as an emerging health threat. According to the Centers for Disease Control, in 2018, there were 1,856 opioid-related deaths in my home state of Tennessee, the highest number to date. And quite frankly, we mentioned about the life expectancy not long ago. It's the first time in my lifetime that life expectancy has plateaued and actually gone down, and it's because of the opioid epidemic, the drug overdose deaths that have caused this. Chances are you know someone that could be a friend, an elderly family member, a coworker, a baby who has been affected by this crisis. This epidemic is decades in the making and affects everyone, Republicans and Democrats, young and old, urban and rural, and all classes of society. There's no single cause for how we got here, and there's no silver bullet for how we solve it either. What's most clear is that we cannot sit idly by and let this epidemic continue to ravage our country and our friends and neighbors. Opioid abuse among the elderly is a real and emerging issue, and by allowing the use of this grant funding to address misuse by older Americans, we can take a step to ensure our nation's seniors do not fall victim to drug addiction and abuse during their later years. In East Tennessee, opioid addiction abuse is one of the leading causes of death, and any assistance we can provide to prevent and deter that occurrence, even among the elderly, is money well spent. By working with state and local organizations, we can ensure there are educational and health resources available for our seniors. I appreciate the opportunity to address this issue in a bipartisan manner, and I urge my colleagues to support this amendment.
Thank you. Are there other comments on the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment. All in favor will say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. Ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Gentlelady from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Ms. Jayapal and Mr. Smucker to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4334.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes in support of her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is very important that we address housing instability and homelessness prevention as we're finding ways to ensure that older adults can age in place. And that is what this amendment does. It ensures that federal agencies consider the need for homelessness prevention services as part of their interagency work to help older adults age in place. The amendment directs the new Interagency Coordinating Committee on Age-Friendly Communities to identify ways to coordinate homelessness prevention services for older adults. This will be done as part of the broader work that the underlying bill already authorizes to support federal agencies to coordinate their work to support aging in place. By ensuring that federal agencies consider homelessness prevention as a component of aging in place, we're investing in the safety and the health of older adults, the stability of intergenerational communities, and in our own golden years. I want to thank very much my co-sponsor for this, Mr. Smucker. This is a bipartisan amendment. I think we're seeing homelessness affecting our seniors across the country. Many older adults, most older adults, would like to stay in their communities and their neighborhoods as they age. That is, they'd like to age in place. In a recent AARP survey, 3 out of 4 adults aged 50 and older wanted to stay in their homes as they aged. When older adults can stay in the community, we all benefit from the historical access to knowledge, transformative intergenerational relationships, and the volunteerism and community service that older adults bring to communities. But too often, what I hear from my constituents and older Americans across the country is that there are these very small barriers that keep older adults from staying in the community. A neighborhood might not have any stores that are close enough to walk to, leading to food insecurity for older adults who can't drive. And a neighborhood invested in keeping that older adult in the community might invest in a free local shuttle to the store, or set up a network of volunteers to bring food to people's homes. Or they might choose to encourage the development of a local market that persons without cars could walk to or from. These types of interventions are possible. They're often extremely simple. They save communities money, and they're tailored to the needs of local neighborhoods. When we as legislators support aging in place, we're making fiscally and ethically sound policy, and we're investing in a future where we all stay rooted in our communities. But for many seniors, housing instability is one of the key barriers that will keep them from aging in place. Middle-income older households face an increasing burden in paying for their housing, with some paying 50% or more of their incomes on rent. That's just unsustainable. The number of older Americans who are experiencing homelessness is growing, and older adults who become homeless experience extreme health impacts, including increased rates of memory loss and chronic illness, and a mortality rate that is 4 times higher than that of older persons with housing. This isn't the direction we want for anyone, and especially not for older adults. No one should have to spend their golden years in a shelter or on the street. We can and must do better, and I believe this amendment gets us in that direction. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
Bill, gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Smoker, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for recognizing me. I'm very proud to co-sponsor this amendment with my colleague, Representative Jayapal. And I'd like to say as well, I'm glad that we are here today working to improve the Older Americans Act. As many of my colleagues have already said, this is an important law that provides needed support for states and area agencies on aging to help seniors maintain their independence and health as they grow older. But it is true our nation is also struggling with a growing problem of homelessness within the senior population. As of 2014, there were 306,000 homeless individuals in the United States, which, by the way, is an increase of 20% since 2007. And older Americans, seniors, now comprise 31% of the country's homeless population. It is a problem that we must address, and part of the solution must be ensuring that current services are being provided as efficiently as possible. This amendment would add the coordination of homelessness prevention services to the list of activities that the Interagency Coordinating Committee on Age-Friendly Communities would provide recommendations on. I hope this is a first step toward a future in which no senior has to worry whether they have a place to sleep at night. I appreciate very much the Congressman from Washington leading on this issue, and appreciate the opportunity to work with her on that. I urge support of the amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The others who wish to be heard on the amendment? Young lady from Oregon.
Thank you. I move to strike the last word.
Young lady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Representatives Jayapal and Smucker for introducing this important bipartisan amendment, which I strongly support. It improves the bill. As someone who has spent a significant amount of time recently with the senior population, I know how essential housing is. Everyone should have the dignity of a roof over their head and a safe place to live. And as we have seen in Northwest Oregon and across the country, skyrocketing housing costs have been forcing families to homelessness. It's unacceptable. I've heard a lot about the lack of affordable housing in my community. In fact, I did a series of listening sessions during which I heard about an elderly woman living in her car. That is unacceptable for anyone. The local and state governments, I know, together with nonprofits and other local officials, are doing a lot, but we need to do our part. Congress needs to do a better job of supporting and funding housing programs and homelessness prevention services that help people, especially older Americans, access support and stay in housing. And I, again, thank the representatives for introducing this bipartisan amendment, which is a good addition to the bill, and I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support it, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Are there other comments on the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. All opposed will say no. Ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there other amendments? There being no further amendments, the question now occurs on the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended. All in favor of the amendment nature of a substitute as amendment will say aye. Aye. All opposed will say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment in nature of substitute is agreed to. There being no other members who wish to speak on the bill, I'll now entertain a motion from the gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that the Committee on Education and Labor report the bill H.R. 4334 to the House of Representatives with an amendment in the nature of a substitute and with the recommendation that the amendment be agreed to and the bill as amended do pass.
The question now occurs on reporting H.R. 4334 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. The chair recognizes a reporting quorum and now asks all in favor to say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. In the opinion, the ayes have it, and the motion to report is agreed to. I now ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make necessary and technical and conforming changes to the bill as amended pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L. I give notice to all members that they have the requisite number of days to file supplemental, minority, additional, or dissenting views. Without objection, so ordered. The committee will now proceed with the consideration of the bill H.R. 4301 and consideration for amendment. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk will now designate the bill.
H.R. 4301 to require the Secretary of Education, in consultation with the Attorney General and the Secretary of Health and Human Services, to publish an annual report on indicators of school crime and safety that includes data on school shootings and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. And without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point, and any amendment offered shall be considered as read. So ordered. I now recognize the gentlelady from Georgia. What purpose does the gentlelady from Georgia wish to be recognized?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Gentlelady from Georgia has an amendment. Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4301 offered by Mrs. McBath of Georgia.
Gentlelady is recognized for,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
just a minute, is this the amendment in nature of a substitute? The clerk is designated an amendment in nature of a substitute, and without objection, the amendment shall be considered as original text and open for amendment at any point. The amendment in the nature of a substitute has already been distributed and is in each of your folders. Gentlelady from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes to explain the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. School shootings and mass shootings have become common in our country. When we send our children off to school, we expect them to learn math, science, and history, not learn how to hide from an active shooter. We expect them to play sports, act in plays, and participate in clubs, not study how to barricade a door and hide in closets without making a sound. Students in my district have come to me in tears because they're afraid of being injured or worse in their classrooms. H.R. 4301 takes the first step towards solving this epidemic. This bill will measure gun violence at schools by collecting relevant data and identifying the factors involved. This legislation allows us to better understand how we can protect our children and provide better resources to our schools as we work to prevent these tragedies. From the students who live in constant fear of being in the next mass shooting in the news, to the students whose stories don't always make the headlines, who see guns every day in their schools and who live with gun violence as a daily occurrence. This amendment will help us protect all of our students by establishing reporting requirements, being honest about this crisis, and standing up for future generations. I want to thank the groups and individuals who have already taken a stand with us in supporting this legislation. Everytown for Gun Safety, Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America, Sandy Hook Promise, the National Education Association, and the American Federation of Teachers, and many, many others. I commend my colleagues, Representative Tulsi Gabbard and Johanna Hayes, for taking a step to protect our students, and I urge all of my colleagues to support the amendment in the nature of a substitute. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Other comments on the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Allen?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you for yielding. This amendment in the nature of a substitute makes a bad bill worse. The legislation represents nothing more than a political point-scoring opportunity for my Democratic colleagues on this committee. Rather than working with Republicans on real solutions that will make a significant difference in the lives of our children and protect them from the tragedy and heartbreak of school violence, Democrats are making a bill that solves nothing. In fact, where is the evidence that this legislation would have prevented even one of these tragedies? The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the Department of Education, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the Department of Health and Human Services all currently provide data on school crime and safety. My colleague, the senior Republican, will offer a Republican substitute in a few minutes. But the majority is missing a golden opportunity for bipartisanship on this topic. A number of bills have been introduced this Congress on this topic by members on both sides of the aisle. We could be having a thoughtful conversation about one of those bills, or even better, we could be putting our heads together to come up with a package of both sides that both sides could agree on. But the majority would rather play politics rather than put the best interests of the American people in play. There is no question by passing this substitute will make this dreadful legislation even worse. I strongly urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment. Our kids deserve better. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady from Connecticut, Ms. Hayes.
Mr. Chair, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I'm proud to have been a co-sponsor of this legislation, H.R. 4301, with my colleagues, Representative Gabbard and Representative McBath. I represent Connecticut's 5th Congressional District, which includes Newtown, Connecticut. My community was rocked by a school shooting in 2012, and the aftermath still grips us today, nearly 6 years later. Today, Sandy Hook Promise released a PSA, which includes active shooter drills. This is the new normal for our children. We need more than prevention drills. We need legislation. Since Sandy Hook, there have been 473 incidents of gunfire on school grounds, resulting in 182 deaths. The number keeps rising, and no significant action has taken place. Our children are taught to duck and cover and to run for shelter. They are learning that school is not a place where they can have an expectation of safety. My last day in the Waterbury Public Schools was just 258 days ago, and I can tell you that this fear is real. It is palpable among students and teachers. This is not political for me. It is heartbreaking, it is unacceptable, and it is traumatic. This legislation is not a stunt. It's a much-needed step to address an epidemic that is upon us. What are my colleagues afraid of? We are simply asking that the data be collected. In order to begin to manage this problem, we must first measure it. We need to fully understand how and why school shootings happen. We need accurate data on how many shootings happen in our schools each year, where they are happening. How many people are injured and killed? We need to collect data on this. If my colleagues are correct, the data will show us that it's not a problem. Just like we need to fund research to study the epidemic of gun violence at the CDC, we need a data system to thoroughly document the extent and nature of school shootings. H.R. 4301 would direct the Department of Education to collect this critical data and would, for the first time, define what constitutes a school shooting and a mass shooting. We need this data from the department to find solutions, real solutions, that focus on finding effective ways to keep guns out of schools and protect our children from violence. We desperately hope that this data will begin to help us craft solutions. I'm grateful to my colleagues and to the chairman for their deep commitment to fighting the scourge of gun violence in our schools and communities. Our children can't wait. Our communities can't wait. I just want to share with my colleagues that I was in a classroom in December of 2012, and I had to respond to my students about what was happening. And the fact that we are not even collecting this data in a real and meaningful way is a dereliction of our responsibility as legislators. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment in the nature of a substitute and the passage of this bill. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Are there other members who wish to be heard on the legislation? Gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. Ready? Numbers don't lie. Since the tragedy at Connecticut's Sandy Hook School, there have been 2,226 mass shootings in America, and no state is immune, nor is any place immune. Not schools, not churches or synagogues, not stores, not county fairs, not nightclubs or outdoor concerts. Mass shooting fatalities have jumped by 347% since the federal weapons assault ban expired. It took just one mass shooting, which took place at a mosque, for New Zealand's parliament to overwhelmingly pass legislation banning these weapons of mass destruction. Despite all of the tragedies and thoughts and prayers and never agains, and many in this nation continue to question the need to prohibit the sale of assault weapons and pass sensible gun control measures that will save lives. So here we are today. The School Shooting Safety and Preparedness Act will lay the groundwork to create a comprehensive database of how many shootings take place at our nation's schools, how many people were killed, and various other statistics, shooter and victim profiles, the motivations behind the shootings, school safety measures in place, and more. These metrics will illustrate what gun-related policies around the nation are most effective and help guide lawmakers in crafting solutions to protect our children against future violence. The goal of this legislation is to paint a clear picture for both policymakers and the American public, what many of us here already know. There are too many damn guns in America, and numbers don't lie. I yield back.
Thank you. Others wish to be heard? Gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. Thank you. Mr. Chairman, worried parents are buying bulletproof backpacks for their children. Students have told me they get to school, and the first thing they do when they get into class is they try to figure out where they can hide and how they can escape. Students of all ages are being traumatized by active shooter drills. We have a problem, colleagues, and we should be addressing it. It's unacceptable that violence is interfering with the education of our students, and unfortunately, there's still a lot that we don't know about school shootings. The committee's work today is one important step to better understand school shootings by providing uniform data about these incidents, including and importantly creating federal definitions for federal definitions for school shootings and mass shootings, and publishing a yearly report on school crime and safety indicators. That is going to help us craft the best policy, colleagues. I'm proud to support this bill, and I'm grateful to my colleagues, Representatives McBath, Hayes, and Gabbard for their leadership in moving it forward. I encourage my colleagues to support this amendment in the nature of a substitute and the underlying bill text, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Adams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I speak in support of H.R. 4301, the School Safety and Preparedness Act. On April 30th, 2019, Ellis Parlier of Midland, North Carolina, Raleigh Howell of Waynesville, North Carolina, were killed by a gunman as they attended their science, technology, and society class at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. right in my home district. I had the privilege of teaching on a college campus, Bennett College in Greensboro, North Carolina, for more than 40 years. And never did I imagine or fear that a gunman would approach my classroom and come in to harm me or my students. I wish I could say that this tragedy at UNC Charlotte was unique, but I know that I'm not alone in this committee in having an incident of this kind occur in their home district. Of the 4 additional students who were injured that day in Charlotte, one of them, Drew Pascaro of Apex, North Carolina, sent a letter to my office asking that Congress immediately pass gun violence prevention legislation, including the banning of assault weapons. I agree with my colleagues that too much access to assault weapons is a major problem. It's painful knowing that I cannot tell Drew that Congress has sent the kinds of legislation that he supports to the president's desk. And while this committee may not have jurisdiction over such matters, I applaud the chair and Representative McBath and my other colleagues for their leadership in bringing up this piece of legislation that tries to address one piece of our gun violence epidemic. For the first time, the federal government will have the tools to track tragedies in schools and better tailor our policy responses to preventing them. What in the world is wrong with gathering the data? If we want to know, that's what we should do. Under this bill, the federal government will finally have conclusive proof of what many of us have already known, that many of us already know to be true. The proliferation of weapons of war is a key factor to why school shootings have sadly become all too commonplace. And with this bill, we can craft legislation to keep these weapons out of the hands of those who would commit these acts of terror, while also having the ability to examine and review safety and prevention protocols at our nation's schools. As a mother, as a grandmother, I am truly concerned about this problem. This bill doesn't completely solve the problem of violence in our schools, but it is a first step, and we need to take it. And one day, I hope to be able to say to Drew Pascaro that H.R. 4301 was the first step in finally putting comprehensive gun safety legislation on the president's desk. I urge support from my colleagues of H.R. 4301. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The other members wish to be heard. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word on the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your long work on this, and to Ms. McBath and others. As a father, grandfather, and as the husband of a middle school English teacher, it is appalling to me that there's even the need for this legislation. The frequency of mass shootings, and school shootings in particular, has become a national epidemic. It feels like every other week, our nation grieves together as we confront yet another act of senseless gun violence that has taken our children, our neighbors, our friends, and our colleagues. How many more innocent lives will we allow to be lost before we finally say enough is enough? We have a moral obligation to do everything in our power to prevent these atrocities everywhere, and especially in school settings that are supposed to provide a safe, welcoming environment for our children to learn and to play. It is heartbreaking to me that our children must now learn the phrase run, hide, and fight along with their ABCs. The School Shooting Safety and Preparedness Act will help us track and report the tragedies that do occur in order to establish safety and prevention protocols to help keep our children safe. I'm proud to join many of my colleagues here in co-sponsoring this legislation to ensure we have every piece of data and information available to make our schools safe. But we cannot stop here. Each day that passes without universal background checks, without a ban on military-style assault weapons, without safe storage laws and red flag laws, we risk the loss of more innocent life. We need to take bold and decisive action to stop gun violence in its tracks. I hope and I pray that there is a day in the not-too-distant future where the School Shooting Safety and Preparedness Act is not necessary and families can put their children on the school bus without fear that they won't make it home at the end of the day. Unfortunately, today is not that day. And so I strongly urge passage of this bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Would the others wish to be heard? Gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Shalala.
Mr. Chairman, I request to strike the last word. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this committee markup on such a pressing issue. Last year was the worst year for school shootings on record since 1970. Students across the country were subjected to 94 separate instances of school violence, resulting in 55 deaths in 2018. One of these instances was the massacre at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, in February of 2018, in which 14 students and 3 staff members were killed. In the year and a half since this shooting, students across the country have made their voices heard. As legislators, we must follow their example and provide comprehensive and research-informed solutions to keep schools safe. This bill marks an important step towards understanding the extent of school gun violence in our country. I commend the committee for making this commitment to our young people, but we must not let our work end here. We need to extend and promote evidence-based programs to stop school shooters. We need better and more equitable emergency preparedness training, and we need to keep guns out of schools by any means possible. Schools ought to be places of safety where students can learn without fear of violence. The recent uptick in school violence threatens our entire education system and has already torn families apart. Students, parents, teachers, and administrators are ready for change. Mr. Chairman, a couple of months ago, I ran into a 9-year-old and asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up. He said he wanted to be a police officer, and I thought that was terrific. And I said, "Why do you want to be a police officer?" The little boy said to me he wanted to be a police officer to protect the kids in his school. No child in this country should pick a profession because they want to protect the kids in their school. That's our responsibility. We're the caring adults of this generation. It's our responsibility to protect these children. And promoting evidence-based programs to stop school shooters. Collecting the data is absolutely critical. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
Chairman Scott, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm proud to co-sponsor this bill because I know, especially as a person of faith, that our Congress needs to move beyond thoughts and prayers in the face of school shootings. For the last 20 years, our students, teachers, and parents have lived with the reality of school shootings as gun violence has become a public health crisis. Meanwhile, America's gun violence epidemic in the form of mass shootings, homicides, assaults, unintentional discharges, and firearm suicides has been infecting America's schools. This bill establishes a federally recognized definition of school shooting. It also provides a means by which we can accurately track these incidents and better measure the impact of policy solutions that are implemented at the state as well as the federal level. We have an obligation to our children and to victims of school shootings across our country to report out the bill before us today. It's just a baby step towards data and facts. The very least we can do as a committee is to track what is going on in our schools so we can develop effective, evidence-based policies that save our kids. As a father of a middle school child and 3 other kids who went through our public schools and the husband of a school teacher, I urge my colleagues, especially my friends across the aisle, to support this legislation, and I yield back.
Thank you. Others wish to be heard. Gentlelady from Massachusetts, Mr. Han.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I move to strike the last word.
Please recognize for 5 minutes.
I don't have a script today, and I have a hard time believing that we're even debating this. We talk about parents and children as though they're not even represented in this room, and I'm one of those worried parents. I FaceTimed my 5-year-old and my 9-year-old daughters this morning before coming and doing this job, and
I know that they're going into a school and I can't ensure their safety. And what the heck are we doing here if we can't ensure our children's safety? So look, in Massachusetts, we call these drills, these shooter drills, the ALICE, so that my 5-year-old Caroline can be concealed from the fact that what she's really running and hiding from is a shooter. And we pose them as a wolf. This is ridiculous. I thought background checks were common sense gun legislation, something that we could agree on in terms of keeping guns out of the hands of people who are going to harm our children. Is there anything more table stakes than research? I don't think you can get any more table stakes and any more common sense and any more basic than collecting data so that we can have our decisions informed by evidence. So you can either be for keeping our children safe and decreasing the worry that is confronting our parents and our communities, or you can be for the status quo. But that's what you're voting on today. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The other members wish to be heard on the amendment in nature of a substitute. Gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Schreier. Dr. Schreier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like my colleague, Ms. Trahan, I did not have any remarks prepared for today, but I first want to applaud my colleague, Ms. McBath, and our other colleagues for introducing this ANS. The fact is, I don't think there's any debate that we have a crisis of school shootings. This is becoming clear to everybody in this country, except perhaps some of my colleagues, and you simply cannot solve this problem if you don't have data. And all this does is bring up data. Dr. Fox's amendment in the nature of a substitute doesn't even mention guns. It spends 2 pages defining a school and defining what a student is, but groups all gun violence, not even mentioned, in with other crimes, making it seem like it's the same thing as vandalism or theft, and it clearly isn't. I'm a pediatrician, I'm also a mom. My child goes to school and has predator drills, just like yours, as though they are escaping a wolf. And I think we owe it to them to have the research so that we can address the problem. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Thank you. The other members wish to be heard? If not, are there any amendments to the amendment in nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Substitute offered by Ms. Fox of North Carolina for the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mrs. McBath of Georgia.
And ranking members recognized for 5 minutes in support of our amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sadly, too many families and communities have suffered unimaginable loss and trauma due to school violence. Though committee Republicans disagree with the politicized overreach of H.R. 4301, we agree that children should feel safe in school. If we're going to help today's kids become tomorrow's successful leaders, they should have the opportunity to learn and grow in healthy environments. That's why we're offering a substitute amendment. It includes common sense measures that offer real solutions without adding additional reporting requirements on data that is not about keeping schools safe. Specifically, the amendment codifies an existing annual informative report on school crime and safety indicators. Instead of arbitrarily picking what data should be collected, the amendment requires experts to determine periodically if the right data is being used. By working in consultation with the Department of Homeland Security, the Attorney General, and the Secretary of Health and Human Services, the Secretary of Education can ensure that the department is collecting and reporting on information that can better inform school officials, parents, and policymakers. Rather than spend countless dollars and hours digging for complex, often very subjective data, which the underlying bill proposes, this analysis can help clarify what actions should be taken to better protect children. The amendment also requires the Department of Education to review current data on safety and prevention measures, and if enough evidence exists, make recommendations about actions schools could take to mitigate or prevent crime and safety violations. Finally, the substitute amendment protects the privacy of students, teachers, and school staff, which thankfully we all agree is important. I encourage my colleagues to support this substitute amendment. It streamlines and simplifies H.R. 4301 and aims to help keep our kids safe at school. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I recognize myself for 5 minutes in opposition to the amendment. Unfortunately, this amendment eliminates a significant portion of the substance of the bill and actually only codifies data collection on school safety broadly that already takes place. Existing data collection is too narrow in scope to capture all forms of gun violence on school grounds and not detailed enough to provide enough insight to policymakers. The purpose of the underlying bill is to provide policymakers and the American public with data on school shootings so that we'll be able to have the evidence on which to develop appropriate legislation. But unfortunately, this amendment removes virtually all data elements from the safety report. It even eliminates definitions of school shooting and mass shooting from the bill. In fact, the amendment goes so far as to delete the word shooting from the bill. Any claim that the bill puts a burden on schools is contradicted by the superintendents, principals, and teachers who've all pledged support of this legislation. American people want Congress to take action to prevent gun violence and school shootings specifically, and the underlying bill actually will go a long way in helping this effort and help to understand the scope of the problem. We should be able to agree on the value of objective data in informing good policy to keep students and school personnel safe. It shouldn't even be controversial. Federal data on gun violence will confirm what we know to be true, that gun violence in America is a public health epidemic that must be solved with bold legislation. This amendment deletes much of the important data collection in the underlying bill, and so I urge my colleagues to vote no on the amendment and yield back the balance of my time. The others wish to be heard. Gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. McBath.
Thank you, Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized.
Thank you. I truly believe that my Republican colleague's amendment is a low point. We should be able to agree on the value of objective data, as it's been stated, informing good policy to keep our students safe. This shouldn't be hard to do. This shouldn't be anything that we even have to discuss. And I'd like to ask, what are my Republican colleagues simply afraid of? What are you afraid of? Are you afraid that the federal data on gun violence will confirm what we know to be true? Gun violence in America is a public health epidemic that has to be solved. By any other means, any other public health epidemic, we would be putting forth all the resources, all the data, all the research to solve it. I think this amendment is cowardly. It's insulting to the hundreds of thousands of Americans that are impacted by gun violence every single day, and especially those that we don't even know their names. We don't even know their faces. We don't know anything about them because they didn't make the national news. And I'm urging my colleagues to vote no on this amendment. I'm urging my colleagues to do right by our children and our families and our teachers. I'm urging you to stand up on the right side of right. Do not be afraid. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Other members wish to be heard. Gentlelady from Connecticut, Ms. Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I oppose this amendment because it is gutless. It is insulting to the work that we are trying to do. This amendment goes so far as to delete the word shooting from the bill. It takes away the spirit of the underlying bill. Just last week, we sat and we heard the president talk about a ban on e-cigarettes, all flavored tobacco, after 7 deaths. How do we, after 7 deaths, realize that it's an epidemic, which it is, and it needs to be studied? Yet we are sitting here debating the merits of a study of the collection of data on school shootings. Again, I urge my colleagues to take politics out of this. This is not about removing anyone's firearms. This is not about defending or upholding the Second Amendment. This is simply about the collection of data so that we can begin to craft solutions for what we know to be a problem. There's no controversy here. I don't understand how this is being dragged out in such a way that we are ignoring the fact that we have a problem that we have to manage, and we cannot begin to manage this problem until we have measured it, until we have codified the data specific to school shootings. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. I urge my colleagues to support the underlying bill. I urge the members of Congress to act, because there are so many young people who will never be able to act, who will never be able to speak up. There are so many educators who are leaving this profession because it's not what they signed up for, and they are afraid to do what they love to do. We owe it to them to at least attempt to address the problem. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. I'd remind members to try to focus their remarks on the legislation and not refer to the motives of our colleagues. Gentlelady from Washington, Ms. Jayapal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I oppose this amendment. I think that by accepting this amendment, we would be making this bill a nothing burger. There's really no reason for us not to want to define school shooting and mass shooting. Our kids are defining it, frankly, because every day that they go to school and they have active shooter drills and their parents go to sleep at night and tuck them in bed and say, you know, I'm glad you were safe today, people are defining this. And this attempt to eliminate these definitions, frankly, comes in a long line of a tradition that my Republican colleagues seem to have of not wanting to collect data. It's interesting that on so many other issues, they want to collect data all the time. We all seem to want to collect data. Why would we not want to collect data on this issue? Why is it that we seem to be afraid of actually defining terms like school shooting and mass shooting? And why would we strike all the data elements for the safety report? I really do not understand that. And I think that they're, you know, to me, I'm not ascribing any motives here, Mr. Chairman, but to me, it seems to me that that is about ensuring that we never have enough data so that we can never define gun violence as a public health epidemic, which is what it is. And I remember being in the public health field when we were working on seatbelts and anti-smoking. And the only way that, frankly, we were able to define those issues and get attention focused on them was when we were able to collect the data and show that these were public health epidemics that affected everybody, regardless of what district you came from, regardless of what party you belong to. These are our children. They are all of our children. And anybody who has not faced a mass shooting in their district, and I'm one of those people, I have every confidence, unfortunately, that I will. I have asked my staff to go and get the best procedures of how to deal with these mass shootings from other members who have experienced them, because what we're seeing is they're not limited to any one school, they're not limited to an area, they're not limited to a party. So, Mr. Chairman, I would just hope that we can go back to the underlying bill. And of course, we will pass it as Democrats. But wouldn't it be wonderful for Republicans to join us in saying that they too care about these kids across the country, in ensuring that they can have safety when they go to school, that they can wake up in the morning and not have to worry about whether they're going to see some of their classmates killed, whether they're going to have to walk over dead bodies in their classrooms, whether their teachers are going to have to throw their bodies in front of their kids to ensure that they don't get killed. This is not a controversial bill. It's a smart bill. It's a bipartisan, it should be a bipartisan bill. It's just about getting the data and defining what a school shooting is, what a mass shooting is, so that we can come up with sensible solutions that should be bipartisan. And I just urge my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, particularly if you're parents, but even if you're not, to think about what this means, to be able to address the epidemic of gun violence across the country, but certainly gun violence in our schools. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The others wish to be heard. Gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Adams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment actually guts the substance of the bill. Knowledge is power, and that's what makes the difference in lives and communities. The purpose of the underlying bill is to provide us as policymakers and the American public with the data on school shootings, but this amendment will strike all data elements for the safety report. It will eliminate the definition of school shootings and mass shootings from the bill. And as a matter of fact, in fact, to avoid any discussion of gun violence and the inalienable role and the undeniable role that guns play in making our schools and our communities less safe, this amendment goes so far to delete the word shooting from the bill. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about all these shootings, mass shootings. Parents and teachers and principals and superintendents and students want Congress to take action to prevent gun violence. But my colleagues on the other side of the aisle and friends and their friends in the NRA don't want the public to understand the scope of the problem. But it is a real problem, and we should be able to agree on the value of objective data in informing good policy to keep our students and our school personnel safe. And this is really not hard, and we shouldn't make it hard. I would ask my colleagues to vote no on this amendment, and let's go ahead and support the students. Let's support our schools, and let's pass the bill. And Mr. Chairman, I urge a no vote, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Others, gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Shalala.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Briefly, I don't know how we can do our work as policymakers unless we have data and we have research. It's fundamental to the kinds of decisions that we need to make. We've been here before. This is nothing more than a new generation Dickey amendment, in this case in Fox clothing. Thank you.
Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, elections have consequences, and I was sent here. I'm a freshman. I'm here for the first time in this 116th Congress, and I was sent here by my neighbor, Juliette Henschel, someone who was never active on policy until she became so upset over shootings in schools. I was sent here by Emma Wine and Megan Dombrowski and other kids who don't even have the ability to vote yet, but have mobilized their parents and their communities through Students Demand Action and Moms Demand Action to demand that their government stop this public health epidemic of shootings that mostly don't take place in schools, that mostly take place in our streets and our homes, but that do also inflict our students and our teachers with fear every day. This isn't a partisan issue in terms of the American people. The vast majority of Americans, overwhelming majorities, despite any party affiliation, support the collection of data about shootings in schools. Let's get about the business of protecting our kids and our educators and reject this amendment in the nature of a substitute, pass the bill, and get on with dealing with this public health crisis. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Wish to be heard. Gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized.
I speak in opposition to this amendment. In fact, I'm sitting here with a pit in my stomach. In this year alone, just this last year alone, there have been 110 school shootings, 228,000 children, their families, their teachers, their communities devastated by these tragedies. And when these shooters go into these schools, they're not determining whether these children are Democrats or Republicans. All right? We are destroying families and children, destroying lives. And then, when these tragedies happen, our leaders want to talk about and rush to do interventions. We want to arm teachers. We want to make sure our kids go to school through metal detectors. We want 5-year-olds to go through live shooter drills. We are raising a generation of students who have to deal with the trauma of fear every single day they walk in to their school. We are the leaders in this country. We have the ability to make change. And instead of us taking these piecemeal little interventions because we want to avoid what really needs to be done. In fact, we have already passed comprehensive background checks that we know saves lives. But instead of doing that, we want to pass these we want to tell teachers to go get a gun. We want kids and families and 5-year-olds to go through the trauma of thinking about what they would do if someone shot at them. But what this bill does, the underlining bill, allows us to collect data so that we have the ability to use that data to do common sense policy that saves lives and protects kids. What is the problem with that? I can't believe how upset I am that this amendment just wants to strike all data elements, wants to eliminate the definition of school shooting. In fact, it wants to avoid any discussion of gun violence and the undeniable role that guns play in making our schools and our communities less safe. I urge my colleagues, since the day one I've been in this Congress, I have done everything to be bipartisan. I have tried to work with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. And I urge you, this is about data. We want to make good choices. This is about us collecting data. I urge you to oppose this amendment and support the underlining bill.
Gentlelady from Minnesota, Ms. Omar.
I move to strike the last word.
Next.
This whole conversation feels very disturbing to me. It is disturbing to actually see that we are debating the simple notion of just collecting data and what should be included in that data this heavily. I can't even imagine how we would ever be able to have a constructive debate on how to solve the underlying issue. The fact that this discussion is so normalized, that there is an opposing side to dealing with this epidemic is also disturbing. School drills should be normal in places where there are war zones. School drills for active shooters should not be normal in a country like the United States. My kids, my 16-year-old, 13-year-old, and 7-year-old, should not lie in wake and worried in their classrooms like I did when I lived in a war zone. Many of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, on the Foreign Affairs Committee, talk about how concerned they are for kids in war zones and the traumas those kids are facing and how we must help find solutions to end that. The fact that you sit here and you are not expressing the urgency of ending trauma that our kids are exposed to every single day as they go through these drills in every single school in this country is disturbing to me. And I don't need you to be a mother or a father to a child that is currently in a school, but to your constituents, you have a responsibility. And I need us not to debate about whether we can include shooter, school violence in the data collection. What I need you to worry about is how fast we are going to end this epidemic so that my 7-year-old, my 13-year-old, my 16-year-old are not in their 30s and still figuring out how to recover from the trauma of worrying when they will take their last breath. This conversation is a conversation that we should all be having in concert. Everybody should collectively be nodding. Yes, we need to collect data. We need to collectively understand what the problem is, and we need to collectively come up with a solution. Because here in the United States, we are supposed to be better than this. People like myself come to the United States seeking safety. My children should not be living with the fears I lived in. I hope you are disturbed with yourselves, as many of us are. Thank you.
Thank you. The others wish to be heard? If not, question is on the amendment nature of a substitute offered by the ranking member from North Carolina. All in favor of the amendment nature of substitute will say aye.
Aye.
All opposed will say no. No. The noes appear to have it.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested, and the clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? No. Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Chicano? Mr. Chicano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. DeSagne? Mr. Norcross? Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mrs. Trahan? Mrs. Trahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mrs. Fox?
Aye.
Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes aye. Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Timmons? Mr. Timmons votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes aye.
Can you call the names of those that did not answer the original roll call?
Mr. Grijalva? Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. DeSagne? Mr. Norcross? Mr. Trone? Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye.
It's Mr. Grijalva reported.
Mr. Grijalva votes no.
Any members desire to vote that haven't voted or wish to change their vote? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 22 yeas, 25 nays.
22 ayes and 25 nays. The motion is not adopted. The motion now is on reporting the legislation, the original amendment in nature of substitute offered by the gentlelady from Georgia. All in favor of the amendment in nature of a substitute will say aye. Aye. All opposed?
No.
The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. Now recognize the gentleman from Michigan for the purpose of a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the Committee on Education and Labor report the bill H.R. 4301 to the House of Representatives with an amendment in the nature of a substitute, and with the recommendation that the amendment be agreed to and the bill as amended do pass.
Question now occurs on the reporting of H.R. 4301 as amendment to the House with a favorable recommendation All in favor will say aye. All opposed will say no.
No.
The ayes appear to have it.
Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested on the motion to report. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
Aye.
Chairman Scott votes aye. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes aye. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Grijalva votes aye. Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes aye. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes aye. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes aye. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes aye. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes aye. Mr. Chicano? Mr. Chicano votes aye. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes aye. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier votes aye. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes aye. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes aye. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes aye. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes aye. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes aye. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes aye. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes aye. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes aye. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes aye. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes aye. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes aye. Mr. Trone? Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes aye. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes aye. Mrs. Strahan? Mrs. Strahan votes aye. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes aye. Mrs. Fox?
No.
Mrs. Fox votes no. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Walberg? Mr. Walberg votes no. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes no. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes no. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes no. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes no. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes no. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes no. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes no. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes no. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes no. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes no. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes no. Mr. Wright? Mr. Wright votes no. Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes no. Mr. Timmons? Mr. Timmons votes no. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes no.
Any members who have not voted? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 27 yeas, 22 nays.
27 ayes, 22 nays. The motion to report is agreed to. And I ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make necessary and technical conforming changes to the bill as amended pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L. I give notice to all members they have the requisite number of days to file supplemental, minority, additional, or dissenting views. Is there, without objection, so ordered? Is there any further business to come before the committee? If not, the committee is now adjourned.